Good morning. I want to start with a question that might make you uncomfortable. What if some of your decisions, your impulses, your temper, even the risks you take, weren't entirely your own? Today we're exploring one of the most unsettling discoveries in modern neuroscience, a single-celled parasite called Toxoplasma gondii that may be quietly steering human behavior across the globe. It sounds like science fiction, but the evidence is real, mounting, and deeply provocative. By the end of this talk, you'll see the human mind and the very concept of free will through a very different lens. Here's the scale of what we're talking about. Roughly 2 billion people, nearly 1 in every 3 humans on Earth, carry this parasite in their bodies right now. And the overwhelming majority are completely asymptomatic, meaning they have no idea they're infected. The parasite doesn't announce itself with obvious symptoms. It doesn't cause a rash or a fever that sends you to the doctor. Instead, it settles into a latent chronic infection, hiding in brain tissue for decades, possibly for life. That is what makes this story so quietly alarming, an invisible passenger living inside billions of brains, whose effects we are only now beginning to measure. To understand why this parasite messes with the brain, you have to understand its life cycle, and it's one of the strangest in nature. Toxoplasma can infect virtually any warm-blooded animal, but it can only reproduce sexually inside a cat's digestive system. Think about that constraint for a moment. The parasite needs to get from a rat or a bird or a human back into a cat. How do you solve that problem if you're a single-celled organism with no limbs, no brain, no tools? Evolution's answer was breathtakingly elegant. Change the host's behavior. Make the rat attracted to cat urine instead of terrified by it. Make it less cautious, more impulsive. And the mechanism it uses to do this, manipulating dopamine, is the very same neurotransmitter system that drives reward, motivation, and risk-taking in humans. Now let's look at the mechanism, and this is where the science gets both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Once T. gondii enters the brain, it doesn't just sit there passively. It forms cysts, particularly in the amygdala, the brain's fear and emotions, and it starts producing an enzyme called tyrosine hydroxylase. This is the rate-limiting enzyme in dopamine synthesis. In other words, the parasite manufactures its own dopamine factory inside your neurons. The result is a chronic elevation of dopamine, the neurotransmitter that governs reward-seeking, motivation, and impulse control. Now consider what happens when you chemically alter someone's dopamine system over decades. We know from Parkinson's treatments that excess dopamine can trigger compulsive gambling, hypersexuality, and poor decision-making. The parasite may be doing something similar, subtly, silently, over a lifetime. The animal data is where the story becomes impossible to dismiss. For decades, the classic finding has been this: if you infect a rat with toxoplasma, it stops being afraid of cats. In fact, it becomes drawn to cat urine, a scent that normally sends rats scrambling for cover. This is not a random behavioral glitch. It is a precisely targeted manipulation of a specific survival circuit, one that directly benefits the parasite by getting the rat eaten. And then in 2016, a landmark study in Gabon looked at chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, and found the exact same pattern. Infected chimps lost their aversion specifically to leopard urine, while remaining perfectly normal in every other way. When a parasite can override the most deeply hardwired fear response in multiple species, we have to ask, what is it doing inside the human brain? So what does the human data show? Let me walk you through 5 well-documented associations. First, aggression. A case control study of 358 adults found that individuals with intermittent explosive disorder were more than twice as likely to test positive for toxoplasma, 21.8% versus just 9.1% in healthy controls. Second, impulsivity. Multiple studies find the strongest effects in younger men, the demographic already most prone to risk-taking. Third, suicide. Toxoplasma seropositivity has been correlated with increased suicidal ideation across several large datasets. Fourth, even traffic accidents appear elevated among infected individuals. Researchers hypothesize this reflects subtle changes in reaction time. And fifth, the link to schizophrenia has been replicated so many times that it's now considered one of the most robust environmental risk factors for the disorder. None of these prove causation, but the pattern is strikingly consistent. Let's look at the numbers from the Kakaro study directly. This was a rigorous case control design published in a peer-reviewed journal using validated psychometric instruments to measure aggression in 358 adults. On the left, the IED group, nearly 22% tested positive for Toxoplasma antibodies. On the right, the healthy control group, just 9%. That's a more than twofold difference, and it held up even after controlling for potential confounders. Now, I want to be careful here. This doesn't mean Toxoplasma causes violent outbursts in everyone it infects, but it does mean that if you walk into a room of people diagnosed with explosive aggression, you'll find Toxoplasma at more than twice the background rate. That's not a random fluctuation. That's a signal worth taking seriously. Now, I promised you an honest look at the evidence, and that means acknowledging the debate. On the left, the case for manipulation is strong. We have a clear molecular mechanism. The parasite literally makes dopamine, and the behavioral changes make perfect evolutionary sense. These effects replicate across species from rodents to chimpanzees. But on the right, the skeptics raise legitimate concerns. Almost all human evidence is correlational, and correlation is not causation. People who are infected might differ from uninfected people in dozens of ways. Socioeconomic factors, cultural practices around cat ownership, dietary habits, and statistically controlling for all of them is extremely difficult. Moreover, some effects appear to differ by gender in ways that a simple manipulation theory can't fully explain. The honest scientific answer is the signal is real, but we're still mapping exactly how it works and under what conditions. The good news is that this field is advancing rapidly, and just in the last year, we've seen two major breakthroughs. In June 2025, a team at UC Riverside published findings showing that Toxoplasma disrupts neural communication by interfering with extracellular vesicles. Essentially, the brain's own messaging system gets hijacked. Meanwhile, researchers at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute in Australia demonstrated how the dormant form of the parasite exports specific proteins to silence immune signals, allowing it to hide undetected in brain tissue for decades. Both discoveries open the door to something we've never had before, the possibility of targeted treatments that could block the parasite's behavioral effects. That's a game changer, and clinical research is accelerating toward interventions that could protect millions. Let me leave you with this. For centuries, we've debated what drives human behavior. Is it nature, nurture, free will, social conditioning? Toxoplasma gondii adds a wild card to that conversation that few of us ever considered. A microscopic parasite that alters our neurochemistry, our risk tolerance, our aggression, and potentially our life outcomes. The science is not settled, and we should resist the temptation to overclaim. But the question is now squarely on the table, and it's not going away. As we learn more about the microbiome, about latent infections, about the countless organisms that share our bodies, we may need to fundamentally rethink the boundary between self and other. 2 billion people are living with this parasite right now. The next decade of research may redefine how we understand human behavior itself. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.